Psycho is known as one of the most shocking films of all time, but it's also one of Alfred Hitchcock's most successful films. So I want to dive into my favorite scene in the film, and it's not actually the scene that you're probably thinking of, but a different one that sets up the film in an even more interesting way and is even more crucial to the narrative than the famous shower scene that most people know the film by. So let's dive into my favorite scene in the film and analyze it from a writing and directing standpoint and why it's such a compelling scene to set up this film. If you're new here, I'm Jordan, and welcome back to my channel. This channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and what filmmaking can teach us about life. For a little background, Psycho was first released in 1960 and was directed by the great Alfred Hitchcock. It was adapted from a novel of the same name by author Robert Bloch and was adapted by writer Joseph Stefano. Psycho is extremely unique in that it follows a very unconventional narrative structure that most films in Hollywood, even to today, can't manage to pull off in a successful way. It was landmark at the time since it set up a false protagonist in Janet Leigh, who also happens to be Jamie Lee Curtis's mother, who was one of the original Scream Queens. The film is very unique and takes a major risk narratively in that it sets up Janet Leigh to be our main protagonist for the entirety of the film, and then nearly halfway through, when they kill her off in that famous shower scene, the rest of the film we follow her sister and her lover, and her sister almost ends up taking on the role of the new protagonist nearly halfway through the film, which is not only very unconventional and super risky, but most times doesn't end up working in most films. So the fact that it succeeded taking such a major narrative risk is testament to the filmmaking capabilities of Alfred Hitchcock and Joseph Stefano and Robert Bloch's incredible novel, but also the performances and the changes they made between the novel to the film that really set this up to be one of the classic all-time horror films and one of the most shocking horror films of all time, especially when it was released in 1960. It was also one of the early films to really dive into the psychoanalytic approach to horror, where we really analyze the psychology behind Anthony Perkins's Norman Bates and the psychology behind what he's doing and his alternate personality of playing his mother and some of the deeper psychological reasons that he's still hung up on the relationship that he had with his late mother and why it's still so damaging to him and makes him so dangerous even today. It also explains why Anthony Perkins's magnetic and incredibly disturbing and creepy performance as Norman Bates is one of the all-time great villains ever put to screen. And the scene we're going to talk about today is a perfect example that really exemplifies his incredible performance in this film and why he is one of the most chilling and scary villains that I think we've ever seen. This film also influenced a lot of the later slasher horror films to come, and at the time when it came out in 1960, it was incredibly shocking for the shower scene and the amount of nudity that it showed, even though it really never shows any body parts, which is also incredibly impressive. And the fact that they were able to use all of these different camera techniques to hide it is even more impressive. So with that set up, let's dive in to the scene. We all go a little mad sometimes. So just to set this scene up, we are roughly about 35 minutes into the film, and we pick up with Janet Leigh's character named Marion Crane. She has stolen $40,000 from her boss. She's a secretary for a real estate mogul in Phoenix, and the only thing holding up her marriage to her fiance is a little bit of debt that he has to pay off before they're able to get married. So she decides she's going to steal the money, embezzle it, and just use it so that she can get married basically for her own selfish gain, and is basically on the run from Phoenix when she stops at Norman Bates' motel because of an incredibly fierce rainstorm that basically strands her there, and this is the only option that's available to her. What we also come to learn is that there is an incredibly creepy, iconic house on the hill that overlooks the motel, and what we learn is that Norman Bates is working the counter. He seems to be the only person that's there on site. It's completely deserted. It's creepy from the get-go, and he mentions that his mother, who's very ill, is also on the property. She's up in the house, and he's her main caretaker. And so this is sort of what we establish, is that Janet Leigh's character Marion is on the run, and we're just starting to get to know Norman Bates in this scene, and he invites her to come eat in the parlor of the motel building. So this is right about where they're about to sit down, and this is where we pick up when we start the scene. First off, I just want to comment how gorgeous the black and white cinematography by John L. Russell is. The reason it's in black and white is mostly because Paramount, the studio that Alfred Hitchcock had an overall deal with, they thought the film was too violent. They thought the script was much too extreme. They didn't want to make it. They basically said, we will not make this and you will not make this. So Alfred Hitchcock, never one to stray from a challenge, said, okay, well, I'll finance it mostly on my own. I'll just get a little bit of a stake in the back end and I'll shoot it in black and white to make it cheaper, and we'll make it for $1 million, which was still a lot in 1960, but at the time, Alfred Hitchcock was commanding much greater budgets in this beautiful Technicolor, which was very expensive. So what's cool about it is he believed in the material so much, he was willing to invest his own money, make it more cheaply with a smaller crew, and it mostly in one location, and he did it almost in the way that indie filmmakers would make it today. Very much still held a lot of creative control. The results really speak for themselves. And again, is another reason why sometimes studios not taking these risks, not really believing in their creative talents, especially somebody as esteemed as Hitchcock at the time, just goes to show that by not taking the risks, you're losing out on all these incredible opportunities and not trusting the creative people to do what they do best, which is create incredible works of art. So I'm so glad that we got the gift of Psycho because of Alfred Hitchcock's tenacity as a filmmaker. When we first move into the scene, the first thing that strikes us is there's a lot of different taxidermied birds that are hung up. There's all different species of birds around, and there's a ton of them.
Sit down.
Thank you.
So clearly there's a fixation with birds here that'll clearly come in here and have some other thematic element and tie into the story. But I also think it's just downright creepy. And I think it just adds a little bit of this unsettling nature. Even Marion Crane, Janet Leigh's character, immediately sees it and thinks, this is odd. This is a very odd thing to have, especially this many of them in a motel. And it's just not usually the kind of thing you see in most motels. So I think it's a good bit of production design that already sort of alerts us that something's a little off here. And it's definitely interesting the way they light it. I think the lighting and the shadows, there's such hard lighting that casts shadows of the birds all around. So it's almost as if the shadows of the birds are also looming over this room, but also this conversation. Nice little bit of blocking where Janet Leigh crosses and Anthony Perkins takes his seat, and they sit almost in synchronicity at the same time.
You're very kind.
It's a nice feel and great blocking by Hitchcock that just feels nice when we see it, even though perhaps it would be slightly unnatural for them to sit at the same time. On camera, it just looks nice, and I think it's very appealing to us. And I just love how kind and polite we're making Norman Bates out to be.
It's all for you. I'm not hungry. Go ahead.
He's very doting, he's very kind, he's bringing her food, wanting to just keep her company. At least it's under the guise of keeping her company.
You eat like a bird.
But he's really trying to just suss her out, and that's where we start to see this tension build very quickly already.
You know, of course.
No, not really.
So already, we're settling into a pretty standard rhythm of coverage. We pretty much have a medium shot on Janet Leigh, and then we have the reverse shot, which is also a clean medium shot on Norman Bates, who's sitting at the chair facing her. And the vast majority of this whole scene, it's nearly a 10-minute dialogue scene, is mostly played in those two angles. It's mostly two camera setups, and then there are 2 or 3 more setups that are close-ups on a different axis, just to sort of change up the rhythm of the coverage, especially when we start learning more intense information. Kind of like we've talked about on this channel before, oftentimes we stay wide as we settle into a conversation, and then as the energy picks up or the tension builds or the suspense builds, especially with what they're talking about, that's when we start to move in. And I think they use some of those sparingly, but at very important moments to punctuate the writing and what's happening in the writing. So that's why we only go to those extra angles here and there, but it's predominantly 2 angles the whole time, which creates a nice rhythm. The other thing we really learn quickly about Norman Bates is that he immediately dismisses that he doesn't really know what the saying "eats like a bird" means, and immediately we're kind of like, that's weird.
I hear the expression "eats like a bird." It's really a falsity.
He brought it up, but then he also doesn't really know. And I think what we're learning too is he has a stutter. So one of the words he's trying to get out, he stutters over it 3 times.
Falsity.
And what we're establishing is that he is not very well socialized. Clearly, he has not talked to a lot of people.
Because birds really eat a tremendous lot.
Because his rhythm of conversation is awkward. It's very abnormal. Clearly, he's not very good at connecting with people or reading the room. And you can see Janet Leigh's expressions kind of like, okay, that's random. It's weird.
I don't really know anything about birds. My hobby is stuffing things. You know, taxidermy.
So I think often in conversation when somebody doesn't know how to connect the dots of what is being talked about, it comes off as very awkward because it's like, well, where did that come from? That wasn't connected to anything we're talking about. Whereas a more natural and smooth conversation, conventionally, there's always exceptions, of course, but conventionally it seems to flow. It seems to feel like it's a ping pong match back and forth where there's no breaks in the conversation. It feels smooth. It feels easy.
It's rather stuffed birds because I hate the look of beasts when they're stuffed.
And you could see right away that she's already a little uncomfortable and she's just trying to be nice because she doesn't really have any other options. She's stranded at the hotel because of the rainstorm. She's hungry, so she's eating some food, but she's trying to just placate and be nice until she can get back to her room. So she's sort of doing this just out of polite courtesy, but I think we're already starting to see something is off about this guy and she's just trying to be nice until she can get out of there. The very interesting thing too that's so contradictory too is he admits he really doesn't know anything about birds. He just likes the hobby or the passion of taxidermy and stuffing things, as he says.
You know, foxes and chimps. Some people even stuff dogs and cats, but oh, I can't do that.
So what's really odd about that is there's so many birds in here. So wouldn't you think that somebody who has that many birds does actually have a passion for birds? So I think already we're starting to see that he is a walking contradiction in that he contradicts himself and the things we're seeing, but what we're hearing from him. So that's also a sign to be alert. I love that as he continues to nervously ramble, he's almost just talking because he doesn't know how else to fill the space. She is just putting jam on her toast. And it's very nice that she has business to do that's keeping her occupied while she's listening. And I think you can tell when she looks up at him and her eyes go a little wide. She's still trying to be nice, but internally she's starting to go, what is wrong with this person? He's very awkward. He doesn't know how to connect. And the more he talks, the more I'm getting creeped out because he really doesn't know when to stop talking. So I think we also are seeing he's not very aware socially of he's a nervous talker. He's a nervous rambler. I'll admit I have the same problem, so I can relate to him on that sense, just not the psychotic parts. But I think it's something that some people do when they're nervous. They don't know what to do. As he's talking, he's inevitably revealing more about his philosophy, his mindset. He doesn't like things that are animalistic or primal. He admits that he doesn't like taxidermy for animals that are more predators.
I think only birds look well stuffed because they're kind of passive to begin with.
He likes ones that are more passive, like birds or prey. So I think that's very telling in that he is someone who wants to be the predator in any situation, tracking somebody, being the killer and not the killed. Again, Janet Leigh's character, Marion, is just being polite.
It's a strange hobby. Curious.
Uncommon, too.
Oh, I imagine so.
She's doing so little talking in this whole scene. And I think that's also a testament to just the writing and the performance and the blocking, but it also really allows Anthony Perkins in the scene to completely shine. He's just talking at her and it's less of a conversation. There could be something off with this guy. So it might be a safe bet just to stay on his good side and do whatever that takes just to keep him talking until she can get out of there. So I think this is really smart on Marion's character's part in that she is solely just trying to be as nice as she can to keep him happy until she can get out of there. But the more he talks, he's revealing so much about himself. But so much of the scene is really Norman Bates talking at her because it's probably the first person he's seen in a long time. And he's almost word vomiting just all of his thoughts now that there is somebody who's here in front of him.
And it's not as expensive as you'd think. It's cheap, really.
So I think that's also relatable for somebody who's incredibly lonely and probably has other psychological issues going on. One other thing we established is he talks a lot about the needles and the sawdust and the chemicals.
You know, needles, thread, sawdust. The chemicals are the only thing that cost anything.
A man should have a hobby.
So what we're clearly starting to see here is that he knows the nuances. He's very detail oriented. He has a good understanding of some sort of sewing or chemicals or science in some capacity that we'll come to learn has an impact later on what he ends up doing and becoming. But I think it's interesting that we're starting to see he does have an eye for the details. Clearly, he's a smart person. It just socially, he hasn't been properly socialized. And so we're starting to see this play out in a normal conversation with her.
A hobby's supposed to pass the time, not fill it.
Is your time so empty?
So we really establish his key philosophy here, his mindset that he vocalizes here is Marion Crane is asking him about his social life. She's trying to get a sense of, does he even have any friends? She asks him.
Do you go out with friends?
He says to her,
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
which I don't think a lot of people would necessarily agree with, maybe some people, but what it's really establishing is he doesn't have any friends. He doesn't have a social life. No wonder his social skills are lacking, to put it mildly. So I think it's one of those things where she's starting to realize how lonely and isolated and essentially living under a rock he is, and that he isn't getting any sort of exposure to the outside world. So that's all he really knows is working at the motel, working the desk.
Well, I run the office and tend the cabins and grounds and do little errands for my mother.
And he even alludes that his mother doesn't have full faith in him to do all the tasks. So
One she allows I might be capable of doing.
we start to get the sense that she is mean to him or might be mean to him. Obviously, what we come to find out is he is one and the same. His mother's no longer living, and he is the mother. And so, of course, this is two different personalities. He's almost talking about his other half, which is really unsettling. But what we really see here is he really is an isolated loner who doesn't have a social life. And in a way, I think this makes us as the audience really feel empathy for him. We start to feel bad that he has this horrible situation that he is in, and clearly he's a smart person who probably could have potential. He just isn't properly socialized, and so it really takes a toll, and it showcases in his worldview. I think what's also masterful about this performance by Anthony Perkins is he looks so dapper. He's a very handsome guy just in general, and his hair looks perfectly combed. He's clean shaven. He's tall and skinny. So he doesn't fit the average physical bill of what a lot of these other killers look like or that we often think of. He's not wearing a mask. He's dressed in pretty normal clothes. He, aside from some of his awkward exchanges, he seems like a pretty normal and polite young man. And so I think that's what also makes it so insidious is his worldview, his mindset, what he's capable of is all the more terrifying, and the way that he can shift from being so polite and even at times almost charming and smiling and cracking a laugh, even though sometimes we get the sense that he is the only one in on these inside jokes, if that makes sense. So when he laughs at his own jokes, oftentimes it's only him laughing. Janet Leigh's character is never laughing, and that says a lot that he is funny to himself, but he's totally isolated in his own brain, and he's disconnected from the rest of the real world, because if he was really connected, I think he would make a joke that both of them would laugh at and both would know is funny. So I think that's very telling in his performance and how quickly he's able to shift believably from being so creepy and unsettling and serious and almost upset to laughing and being charming again. So we see these shifts happen a few more times in the scene. But one of the things I really like about this scene is how much Norman Bates is revealing with every line about himself, and he's opening up, digging deep in many ways, being vulnerable, and she is still not really giving him much to work off of. So she doesn't even tell him where she's really going. So he basically probes her and says,
You've never had an empty moment in your entire life, have you?
and I think he's sort of reading her because she is blonde and she's attractive and probably has a lot of opportunities that she doesn't have time to sit and be reflective, and she's not a lonely person. He has all the time in the world to sit and reflect, but she does admit she's had her own fair share of empty moments, and so it's not all as it seems on the surface.
Where are you going? I didn't mean to pry.
he does at least have the skill set to realize that maybe it was too much. And so he disarms by saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. So he is displaying an ounce of self-awareness here that I think, again, makes us feel as the audience like our tension should drop. We should be a little more trusting. Maybe he's not that bad. He's just a lonely guy and we should feel bad for him. And he can't be all that bad. He just needs a little more attention and connection. But when she still keeps her cards close and she says to him,
I'm looking for a private island.
Metaphorically, I think she's saying that she really does need to kind of be on her own and get to her own sanctuary, her own inner peace, if you will. That's basically her own private island, I interpret, as she's not in a good place. She has this guilt on her conscience of stealing this money. So I think she's starting to realize throughout that maybe she doesn't want to be this person. She does want to come clean.
What are you running away from?
Why do you ask that?
And then again, he pries. I think he thinks he's just making conversation, maybe even making somewhat of a joking statement. But then her eyes raise and we start to see her get really nervous because she starts to think maybe he actually knows where she's going, or he might tell somebody, or maybe he's actually in on knowing about the fact that she stole it and he's tracking her or something like that. So again, this makes her raise her guard a little bit more because she's still in this state of paranoia, but she's trying to contain it and keep it calm. So I love that he's starting to probe and ask these uncomfortable questions, even though he just said, sorry, I don't mean to probe. And then the next line, he basically probes. So he keeps pushing the line, towing the limit to see how much he can get out of her. So that's what I like about the scene, is progressively he's making her more and more and more uncomfortable, as we are getting more uncomfortable too with just his approach and the fact that he's not picking up on any of these social cues. And she's alone with him. This is a central thematic statement, probably one of the most profound and important lines in the whole film, in my opinion, is he starts to go further on his philosophy on the world and his observation that we're all in our own private traps.
I think that we're all in our private traps.
So again, he's comparing humans, us, to animals, because usually an animal is something we'd put in a trap to catch it, and a human would do that to trap an animal for whatever the reason is. So I think he is comparing us to being the animal, and something else more existential is the thing that's trapping us. And I really like that because the whole time he's starting to reveal his philosophy, he really doesn't know the full extent of what she's running from, but she's starting to think more and more that he does. And everything that he's speaking to just so happens to be what's on her mind also. And it's making her feel more and more paranoid. And we see this statement really hit her.
Clamped in them. And none of us can ever get out.
Because she's trying to escape from her own trap that she almost laid upon herself by taking the money in the first place. So I think this is where the gears start to turn in her head. And it's a great performance moment by Janet Leigh, again, who says so little in the scene, but does so much with her physicality, her facial expressions, and the fact that she's slowly eating like a bird through the scene is so great that it gives her something to do as she's pondering. And in a way, I think it's a good bit of business, because normally when somebody's eating, they wouldn't be talking quite as much because you're trying to swallow the food, you're trying to chew it, you're trying to digest. So I really like that everything he's speaking to, it directly mirrors her own anxieties and what's happening. And that's why it's such a well-written scene, why the script is so great, why the direction and performance of it is so great. And again, why this is my favorite scene in the film, even over the shower scene and any of the other more bloody scenes. This scene is what sets up the story and all of the horror around it to be so effective. Now I think we're starting to see Marion engage a little more, where she even offers.
Sometimes we deliberately step into those traps.
Which is exactly what she did by taking the money, doing something that she's never really done before, basically making herself a criminal. And I think this makes her reflect. So in some way, you could argue that even though Norman Bates is the villain, what makes him so compelling is that he does have a sense of philosophy, and he does have strong and smart opinions about the world that are intelligent, intellectual. And I think he gets her to start to actually reflect on her own actions that were not not moral. So in this way, I think it's very interesting, even though that's not necessarily what he is trying to do. I think it just shows that he very much has a clear sense. He is a smart guy. He's just misguided. The other thing that he says that I really like is he's basically connecting the dots that by having these traps that we set for ourselves, that we step into, it's also making us claw at each other in an effort to get out, which also just means we're hurting each other when we create these traps for ourselves as humans. And that's why we almost act like vicious animals to each other.
We scratch and claw, but only at the air, only at each other,
instead of connecting. And so in this way, again, I think the sentiment of what he's saying is that he wishes we all connected more than we do, and this is something that's wrong with the world. And
for all of it, we never budge an inch.
I got to admit, I agree with him. I think he's right. And this is what makes him a compelling villain. This is one of the most interesting statements in the whole movie as well, and any movie, is he basically admits,
I was born in mine. I don't mind it anymore.
Where he's stuck with his mother. He can at least see that this isn't a great situation, but he's just accepted it. And then she goes,
Oh, but you should. You should mind it.
This isn't a great situation, in so many words. And he goes,
Oh, I do. But I say I don't.
So he's starting to really reveal that this is something that he's just dealing with, but he really does have deep resentment for it, which makes him all the more terrifying for what he might be capable of. This is where the energy completely shifts. And one thing I love is that this is the first time we've gone to a different angle that's much more tight, and it's a profile, but it's a low angle on Anthony Perkins. And the bird is up in the corner, iconic shot. And I think it, again, speaks to this whole theme of the birds, but the energy shifting now because she's now starting to bring his mother into the mix of the conversation by making the most bold statement she's made this entire time. The entire time up until now, she's just been nice, placating, responding, but not really adding much to the conversation. And now she says,
If anyone ever talked to me the way I heard, the way she spoke to you.
You see his expression shifts. We also go to a tighter angle on Janet Leigh where she clocks that his reaction was not acceptable. And I think she realizes, oh, wait a minute, this is the first time I've really made a statement, made an opinion, made an observation, and he didn't seem to take it well. So I think she's now starting to realize, what have I gotten myself into? We can't help but empathize and almost root for Norman Bates when he says,
When she talks to me like that, I feel I'd like to go up there and curse her and leave her forever.
And we see the interior working, that he's actually really opening up and expressing his frustration for the situation he's in, and that his deep desire would be to get out of there and actually live a normal life, maybe just live where he could hang out with friends and just do something where he's not just caretaking for his mom, who seems to be abusive.
But I know I can't.
But he's placating and trying to make it seem like she's not that bad. He's downplaying. I love this dialogue so much because he says
she's ill.
And Marion Crane just assumes, oh, she's sick physically.
She sounded strong.
No, I mean ill.
Like, he just repeats the word, but what that symbolizes is mentally. And I think that's such a nice way to impress upon her, no, this is the version of ill that I'm talking about, which makes her, again, all the scarier because she's physically able. But up here, we don't know what she's capable of. This is also a really important set of lines from Norman Bates in that he reveals that his father died when he was very young. So basically, his mother raised him pretty much as a single mother, all by herself.
She had to raise me all by herself after my father died. I was only 5, and it must have been quite a strain for her.
And she met another man who basically talked her into building this motel with the little bit of money that the late husband, Norman Bates' father, left behind for her.
A few years ago, Mother met this man, and he talked her into building this motel.
This is how the motel came to be. He's been with his mother this whole time, his whole life. That's why it's so hard for him to just leave her, is she raised him all by herself. His dad wasn't in the picture. And so I think there's this strange bond that's developed there, unhealthy bond over time, because she's not well mentally, but she's the only thing that he knows, so he can't just leave her. So I think there also is a little bit of honor in the sense that he is loyal to her. He's not just going to leave her. He does have loyalty. This is where we learn that the second husband also passed, and the mother really started to kind of go off the deep end at that point and really only had Norman Bates.
When he died too, it was just too great a shock for her. And the way he died.
But he still wasn't an adequate replacement.
She had nothing left.
Except you.
This is where it seems like things started to take a darker and darker turn.
Well, a son is a poor substitute for a lover.
And then again, as she suggests, I think she's just trying to be helpful. She says, why don't you get away from here? Like, live your life. You're still young. You seem like you have promise, and this situation is not good for you, in so many words.
Why don't you go away?
To a private island like you?
So he paints this very vivid picture with his words.
Who'd look after her? She'd be alone up there.
He basically uses all these sensory words just to show us how horrifying it would be.
The fire would go out. It'd be cold and damp like a grave.
And how awful it would be if he left his mother alone. She'd have nobody. She wouldn't know what to do. And in this way, he starts to make a pretty profound case as to why he really is trapped in the situation. He doesn't want to be there.
If you love someone, you don't do that to them even if you hate them.
There's no option to leave his mother alone. The sacrifice that loving a family member can bring, sacrificing your life so that you can take care of your mother, even though it's not ideal and she's not well, is somewhat honorable, and again makes us endear to him and makes him much more compelling and relatable. And then I love this direction and staging by Hitchcock. This is absolutely magnificent here, where again, Janet Leigh trying to be helpful, and he's saying,
I don't hate her. I hate what she's become. I hate the illness.
And again, trying to be helpful, but she says,
wouldn't it be better if you put her someplace?
And when we cut back to Norman now, we're even closer. Again, it's a different angle on a different axis.
You mean an institution? A madhouse?
But this is the closest angle we've seen in the entire scene up until now. It's been fairly wide, and we start to see the energy shifts again. So I love that whenever the energy shifts, we're getting closer, and it's usually only after a series of shots at that same focal length where we started wider, we moved in to a little bit medium close-ups, and now we're starting to see the depth and how scary Norman can be. And I think right away when he repeats her, almost mocks her, we see that she realizes she messed up. She's probably realizing she shouldn't have said that, shouldn't have said anything at all. Every time she speaks, he seems to twist her words in the worst way. So there's almost no way to win when you're talking with him. And what's also brilliant is this is where we are starting to bring in the score for the first time in the whole scene.
People always call a madhouse someplace, don't they? Put her in someplace.
Up until now, there's been no score. It's just been the dialogue carrying everything. The scene makes me feel very similar to the scenes in Silence of the Lambs, where Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter are having these very intense conversations that get progressively wider to closer and closer. And we really start to only bring the score in toward the very end of the scene because the strength of the conversation is just so interesting.
Tell me his name, Doctor.
So I think this is a perfect example of how this is done earlier on, and this set the model, I think, for a lot of other great dialogue scenes to come in future years.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean it to sound uncaring.
Brilliant, vivid, evocative imagery. So many of the lines that Norman Bates has and so many of these monologues in the scene are beautiful because he's using so many sensory words in his words.
Have you ever seen the inside of one of those places? The laughing and the tears.
Things that illustrate the visuals of what we're seeing, the sounds, the sensations, the touch, the smell, the feel.
The cruel eyes studying you. My mother there.
He's painting these pictures for us that are so vivid. We almost see ourselves there. And this is where he really starts to mock her and really make her feel bad. Like she's so virtuous. She knows all the answers.
She's as harmless as one of those stuffed birds.
I am sorry.
He's starting to say, well, let me show you what real pain and an institution can really be like. Because clearly he's probably seen one, probably been there, seems to have.
It seems she's hurting you. I meant well.
People always mean well.
So I think this makes him even creepier because he's really starting to turn on her in this creepy way and really make her see she doesn't know what she's talking about. He knows way more about that world than she ever will.
They cluck their thick tongues and shake their heads and suggest oh so very delicately.
I think that's what's also so smart about this scene is that we also empathize with Marion's character, and that this whole time he's been saying and alluding to these bad things that his mother's doing or saying, or the fact that he's trapped with her and she can be volatile. So how else would she feel to say, hey, I'm just trying to offer helpful solutions here? And then that's when he starts to twist it and make her feel like the villain in this situation. And there's almost no way to win when you're talking with him. He now flips his tune again and says,
she's as harmless as one of those stuffed birds.
but she's harmless. Like, she's fine. It's just the illness. It's not her, which is sort of a logical tactic you can make, but it's not necessarily a true statement, but he's just making the case. Both reactions are valid, but we also start to empathize with Marion a little more in this moment. And it's like a tug of war. At times in a great dialogue scene, we're pulling to one side more for one character based off what they're saying, and we're empathizing with them. And then a few seconds later, we could be on the other side of the tug of war going, wait a minute, but I think this person has a compelling argument too. And that's what makes great drama. And the score continues to creep and rise in tension with these strings that make us just feel downright chilled to the core and unsettling and straight up scared as Marion Crane is starting to feel the same exact thing.
Of course, I've suggested it myself.
And what I love is that we're basically on the same page with Marion this whole time. So as she's starting to get creeped out, we are too. We're starting to really realize he's saying things through gritted teeth. His eyes are starting to get vengeful and angry, and his head is starting to shake as if he's scolding somebody and wants to cause them pain. And I think that's where we start to see the capacity that this guy is a little unhinged, and he could actually be very dangerous and violent based off the way he's talking about things. But what's so compelling is, again, we're super scared. One moment he's chastising her, and then he flips his tune back around and goes,
Of course, I've suggested it myself. But I hate to even think about it.
Where he's bringing us back to a place of stabilization, relieving some of the tension and making us feel like we can endear and relate to him again. So it's this very chilling back and forth where one moment he's angry and the next he's fine and relatable and cordial again. So it's very much this back and forth that makes this performance so incredible. And then when he sits forward again, he's going back to that more angry place where he goes,
It's not as if she were a maniac. A raving thing.
And I love this line. This is one of the most famous lines from the movie where he goes,
She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
I think that's really the thesis statement for this movie, is that he is rationalizing that once in a while, the state of the world is so hard. It's so difficult. We're so ugly to each other. We find our way into these traps. We claw at each other and we're helpless. So once in a while, if we have a burst of violence or an outburst or we go a little crazy, that's fine. That's to be expected. It's all good, which is pretty flawed logic, but it actually makes sense in the context of everything else he's laid out in this argument prior. You can sort of empathize as to why he would think that, and the fact that he's rationalizing and justifying when this stuff happens. If it's violent, if it's unhinged, if it's aggressive, if it's evil, it's only a little bit. It happens here and there. It's to be expected. It just is what it is. That's what happens when you live in such a difficult world. And I think he's justifying it for his mom, but also for himself. And this is really the chilling line that I think justifies every other action that he does in the film, and is scary because it somewhat is a good argument if you look at everything else before it that he laid out. This is basically where we're starting to ease out of the conversation. It's so chilling because after he says that line, he laughs and seems to bring himself back to this charming persona again, and seems to just throw off all of that intense discourse as if it never happened.
Haven't you?
So the way he shifts back and forth so quickly but so effortlessly and believably is what really is a testament to the acting here, but also really the writing and the performance and the structure of the scene. And I also love the line where she admits,
Sometimes just one time can be enough.
what can handle it for the rest of your life, which she's also talking about her own actions. But this very much makes her think on everything that she's done and consider, for one, I have to get out of here because now I really don't trust this guy, but she's still trying to be nice and still trying to placate so she doesn't set him off now that she knows he's unsteady and unstable. But she's also admitting that she did learn something from this conversation.
Norman.
Oh, you're not going back to your room already?
I love that she stands up. She really is trying to symbolically show that she's trying to leave this conversation, and he is trying to get her to stay there and keep talking longer, even though she's very tired. But one thing that is really special about this moment for Marion is she says,
I'm very tired, and I'll have a long drive tomorrow, all the way back to Phoenix.
Tells us that she's going back, in theory, to return the money that she stole. So we see that this conversation, as creepy as it is, and how quickly she is trying to get out of there, it also shows that she is going to go back and do the right thing. She had this change of heart, which really is impactful. So this scene really did a lot to allow her to reflect on her own actions.
I stepped into a private trap back there, and I'd like to go back and try to pull myself out of it.
So in this way, this conversation with Norman wasn't all completely bad. He tries one more time just to see if she wants to keep talking.
Are you sure you wouldn't like to stay just a little while longer? Just for talk?
Clearly, he really is valuing this human connection. What's also amazing about this scene is how awkward he was at the beginning. And what's interesting is at the end, he's almost again back in that very just awkward, polite type of headspace. So I think this makes him so multifaceted, but also so terrifying. And he also finally does accept when she says she really is tired, she has to go. He does accept it and lets her go.
I'd like to, but...
All right. Well, I'll see you in the morning.
An uncomfortable but a smooth transition to end our scene. Then we shift to another angle from the side as she walks away in profile.
Good night.
The thing I also really love is that they only learn each other's names toward the very end of the scene, where he finally says,
Thank you.
Thank you, Norman.
And then he asks her what's her name, and she says,
All right, Miss
Crane.
Crane, that's it.
and again, he's back to his politeness. He says, I'll bring you breakfast bright and early. She responds, it's really early, as in she's going to get out of there super early. She is trying to basically symbolize to him, I'm good. You don't need to bring me breakfast. She's just going to try to get out of there as soon as she can, because I think she's uncomfortable at this point. But he says,
I'll bring you some breakfast, all right? What time?
Very early. Dawn.
The interesting thing is she actually gives her real name here, Marion Crane. Partly why this is interesting is the reason he asks is he's going to double check it on what she signed for her name for the check-in at the front desk. She actually gave a different name there, and when he sees that is where he's really triggered, because he realizes this whole time he's been trying to build this rapport. He's already very skeptical about people and humans and how we're not good to each other, and then she basically lied to him when she checked in. So now he really feels like, oh, she's just another one of those too. So this makes her easily a target when we get into the very next scene, which is the famous shower scene. So what I love is this scene sets up all of the things in motion. It really gives the backstory as to why Norman is who he is, why he's there, why there's a motel, the mother character. It sets up everything that's to follow, and especially when we learn the true nature of who he is and the identity of his mother later, it is all explained and comes full circle because of everything that we learn in this scene. And this is why it makes it such a pivotal and important scene, is it explains his pathology and his worldview and how he's justifying everything that he does in the film to come, even the horrible acts that he's about to commit. And I also think it's such a great scene because it sets up how he had this full conversation with Marion. We learned so much about her, and we even feel for her because we're excited that she's finally going to do the right thing. We're starting to really build this sympathetic connection with her because we know she's about to go back to Phoenix to deliver the money that she stole, to make everything right. She had a change of heart, and then he kills her. So that's what makes the shower scene that much more shocking shocking too. And I love that this whole scene comes right before the shower scene and makes it all the more disturbing when we realize, see, he went through this whole arc. He made the time to connect with her. He seemed like he liked her and wanted her there. And then he so easily switched into the mother identity to kill her so brutally in the shower. So helplessly while she's naked and exposed with the knife. That's what's so great, is this is the perfect setup for that horrific scene to come. That concludes why Psycho is one of the most shocking films ever made and why Norman Bates is one of the most terrifying villains of all time. I want to hear from you. Comment below your favorite memories of the first time that you watched Psycho, or what your favorite scene in the film is, or what this scene means to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know if there's any other scenes from Psycho or any other scenes from any other films that you want me to cover, and I will definitely make sure we get them covered. And for more movie breakdowns, you can check out more of my videos like this series I did on The Silence of the Lambs, which you can check out here, so definitely give it a watch. And stay tuned for next week, where we'll continue to break down different scenes from some of the best horror films of all time, so I will definitely see you then.